I'm so happy to be joined by Jacob Stewart, who is the Deputy Opinion Editor over at the IndyStar. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
So, of course, a lot of things are happening right now, not just in Indiana, where I'm from, but really all over the country when it comes to data centers, and obviously AI, e-commerce, Amazon, Google, Meta, Chinese companies even like Huawei, which is in Canada. So lots of things are happening in the technology sphere, and of course you have to build places when you do this. And I'm noticing around Indiana, and not just around Indiana, but around the entire country, in suburbs of Chicago, of course, suburbs of even Cheyenne, Wyoming, large data centers coming up. Do you mind giving us a breakdown of what's going on exactly and who's funding this?
Sure. So I recently wrote a column on this for IndyStar. So Indiana has about 70 data centers right now. And as you mentioned, they're to essentially power, at least the newer ones are essentially to power artificial intelligence. Requires significant amount of electricity to do so. I mean, if you think about just the amount of data that has to go into artificial intelligence, um, I mean, it's mostly free. It's free to most people right now because it's gathering data. That data has to go somewhere. And most data centers currently are in Virginia. They've got a couple hundred, but more recently, especially as we've seen these data centers come up for AI specifically, they've started popping up in Indiana. We have somewhere around 10 planned right now or in the works. One in Franklin Township, which is pretty close to where I'm at. One in Morgan County, a couple in Northwest Indiana, one in Fort Wayne. Then there's a couple more, and there's a significant difference between the data centers that are just for regular internet use and the data centers that are for artificial intelligence, namely because they're a lot bigger. Um, I read that the 10 planned in Indiana right now are projected to use around 9,700 megawatts of energy. And for context, that's going to more than double what our current energy demand is as a state. And we are already forced to import our energy from Michigan and the surrounding states because we don't have enough to go around. So it's definitely a major issue with these data centers coming up. There, I think it was back in 2018, 2017, we passed a bill statewide um, that led to a lot of tax abatements and subsidies for data centers. A lot of local governments are adding on to that. So these companies get millions of dollars in tax breaks or abatements, in addition to the promise of cheap electricity. And that cost of building up that electricity it ends up being passed on to the consumer because Indiana is a state where investor-owned utilities basically own the market. You can't directly sell electricity to consumers unless you are one of these utilities. So when they build up, you know, a natural gas plant, for example, to power a data center, that cost of building up that plant, having all that capital, millions of dollars, ends up getting passed on to consumers. Um, so yeah, 10 data centers, 9,700 megawatts of energy. It's a big deal for sure.
And something that's really interesting, I think, as a person living currently Generation Z, is obviously if you're 70, it's going to still suck because you're going to see more data centers going up basically all around the country, no matter you live in Idaho, Rhode Island, Virginia, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. But obviously, green energy is big right now. But I'm sure in the future it's going to all change. Could change in a bigger direction with nuclear energy, could go in another direction from that. What do you think is going to happen with these data centers? Do you think that they're only going to be around for 20 years and then they're going to be abandoned and it's going to look like, as we like to say, parts of cities that are falling apart with manufacturers that have left? It becomes just a little bankrupt pool, and obviously rats get inside of them, and no new jobs move into those places, and they eventually get torn down. Or where do you see this going 20 years from now? Let's take
Well,
2040 or 2050.
yeah, I mean, I'm sure these data centers will be around long after that point. I mean, we've made it very, very cheap for them to do so. Um, and I think the projected lifespan is well over that. And I'm sure we'll just continue to see more data centers pop up, just because the need is just increasing and increasing, as we see artificial intelligence advancing more and more. And then another thing to note is that these data centers don't produce many jobs at all. It's mostly infrastructure. So if you think of like a road, it's going to cost a lot to build the road. But then when it comes to day-to-day operations, you don't need to employ somebody to I guess run the road, so to speak. So these data centers are infrastructure essentially. They may employ tens of people and use up significant amounts of energy at the same time. So I think that's another point to consider. Um, Although, caveat to that, there may be a case in the future where they could bring in more jobs for technology. Purdue has a semiconductor manufacturing plant. Um, People I've spoken to have said that this artificial intelligence, these data centers are the infrastructure to bring in those jobs eventually, but there's no guarantee, especially since we had to use I mean, so many subsidies and tax abatements to bring them here and promise, lower energy costs. It's questionable if we have the skill set as a state to maintain those higher paying, more beneficial tech jobs. But that's definitely something we need to consider in the future as a state.
Where do you see this going from an environmental standpoint? Of course, look, I don't care if somebody's a Republican or a Democrat. We all want our streams to be protected. Um, we don't want bad chemicals and toxins getting in the water. You look what's happened with the Flint water crisis, which is in the Midwest, as well as other places around the country too. You look at obviously California, which that's another story. But where do you see this going from an environmental standpoint?
Right. Yeah. So another big aspect of the data centers is they use a ton of water. And if you were following this last legislative session, there was two really major bills that were kind of trying to address both the water usage and the energy usage long term. Senate Bill 4 it was all about making sure we have efficient management of our water resources at the state. And then I forget the number, but there was another bill that essentially allowed utility companies to pass on the cost of small modular nuclear reactors, and regain those development costs. So very forward-looking, long-term policies, and you can debate the merits of them. Some people have said another, specifically with the SMRs, it's a corporate tax break with no guarantees. Um, but at the same time, others have said that small modular reactors may be the answer, and I mean they're able to provide pretty much 24/7 green energy for these data centers, and so that's a really important factor. At the same time, they are probably a decade away from production, so it's a risk for sure. So that's something that people definitely need to understand when they're investing in this sort of thing. As a taxpayer, especially since it is the cost has got to be passed on to them somehow. Um, so that's kind of how I see it environmentally. I think long term, nuclear is going to end up being a big part of the energy generation for these data centers. But in the short term, we're probably going to see a lot more of a push to keep coal plants open, for example. We've already seen that with Duke Energy. Um, they were going to retire two of their coal plants, but I think it was Reliable Energy won a settlement against them. And now they're going to study whether or not they can sell it to an independent energy producer instead of just retiring it. So we'll probably see the coal plants stay open, more natural gas be built um, in the short term, so the next 10 years or so. And there may be significant amounts of that being built, especially like natural gas, because it is one of the cheapest forms of energy to invest in, just to get that generation up quickly. So there's definitely a give and take. There are environmental concerns, of course, with water and with the type of electricity produced and the generation form of generation. So a lot of things to consider for sure.
How is this going to impact, let's just take it a step farther, humanity? Obviously, not just in the United States, but in China, Russia, heck, even Germany, even places like Nigeria. How is this going to impact humanity in the coming decades, in your opinion?
Yeah.
What's going to be the biggest pro of this and the biggest con of this? Because obviously, AI is going to be impacting everything.
Mhm.
Even some of the poorest third world countries, it's going to be impacting. So, where do you see it going on that end?
Well, AI is a really interesting thing in that it has so many potential benefits. You could look at anything from healthcare to just a variety of other industries that can utilize AI to be more effective, more efficient. On the flip side, though, more than likely it's going to lead to a lot of job loss. So there are two distinct issues there to consider. At the same time, you don't have any like small businesses and that are building AI. You can't really look at it from we have to support the little guy when you're talking about investing in AI. So long term, I could definitely see it us moving towards more of like a large corporation focused economy, I suppose, just because of AI, and there are definitely policy considerations to that. There's going to be job loss, obviously. There's going to be greater concentration of wealth that needs to be addressed. And so these are issues that are going to be probably some of the foremost issues of our time as Gen Z, um, and something we're going to need to consider in the future. And we're already starting to see it now. I mean, big tech is just there's so much concentration of wealth there, um, and it's just something we have to consider as a state too, because these big tech companies are largely headquartered on the coasts, and so there's a lot of money being redirected towards the coast, that is essentially being paid for by Hoosiers. And all these data centers have promised to reinvest in their communities. And so there's definitely a give and take there. So I see there being a lot of job loss potentially, a lot of improved, more efficient um, jobs. I think we're going to increase our productivity as a nation. But there's just a lot of things to consider.
And why is this such an important issue that people should care about? Obviously, I touched on how this is going to impact not just the United States, but the entire world. Why should people care about this issue so much? Because every single day you hear about three hot topics right now. You hear about Jeffrey Epstein, the Epstein files. You hear about, oh, who's spending more money in Congress, the Democrats or the Republicans? And then you hear about, obviously, the two big conflicts happening right now in the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia and possibly Taiwan and China, and you hear all about World War III, but why should this be a bigger focus for
Well,
everybody?
Well, it directly impacts a lot more people. Anyone who owns a home or rents a home has a utility bill that comes to their house every month or so, and we're already seeing rates being risen. Um, Sometimes explicitly because of the cost of building this infrastructure up, sometimes not. But it is very much a kitchen table issue, just the cost of energy in general. And of course, when you raise demand, you raise the cost. So if these data centers demand a lot of energy, it's going to cost more for you. So that's probably the most practical reason why people should care. Looking more long term, just the fact that artificial intelligence has the capability of bringing such a substantive change to every single industry. Um, I mean, we're at the point now where we need to be teaching people how to use it effectively at a high school level at least. It's not something we can really avoid, just as a whole. But there needs to be guardrails on it too, and we need to start considering those now before it gets to be a bigger issue.
Appreciate the insight on that a lot. And what is something, I'll close with this. What is something that you think could be a very, I guess I don't want to say a good or a bad side effect, but what do you think is the biggest thing that we could cheer about with this? Obviously, we've touched on a lot of the negatives and you've mentioned a few positives. But what is, I guess, one good thing about this? Is it going to help us get to Mars one day because technology's better? Or what's, I guess, one positive?
Well, I guess starting again from like looking at kitchen table issues, um, I mean, it's obviously there are landowners who have been able to get a lot of money from selling their land to data centers. And I can definitely understand that reasoning for them. Especially it's a lot of it's farmland, and we're just the farming industry is as a whole, it's shrinking. There's a lot of large corporate landowners that own a lot of the industry. It's getting much harder to make money as a farmer. So on a very practical level, that is a benefit. And the investment in the communities. Um, Looking at AI more generally, though, it just the fact that it has the capability of making you a more productive, like worker. As a journalist, as a columnist, you know, we use AI. We have ethical policies around it, but it's very important to just be able to use it to make yourself more effective as a worker and to it's one of the skills that like we should have to we need to show our employers we know how to use this effectively and to make ourselves better writer or better workers and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future, especially in more white collar jobs. Just the being able to show that you can use AI effectively to make yourself a better worker. It's going to be really important in the next decade.
I guess kind of one last thing I just want to add in
Mm,
is it feels like the neighborhoods are getting smaller and smaller. They're owned by one big corporation or two big
mm,
corporations, BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, so three. And on top of that, these data centers that are going up, if you do get to live in a very small house that you can barely afford, that BlackRock basically owns, across the street from you, you see a big warehouse. And then you got people like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Google, and people like that, and Jeff Bezos, who obviously are living on 50 different islands and have 50 different private jets, while I'm barely able to afford a house that I'm renting from BlackRock, that I can literally see a 200-foot warehouse across the street from me. So obviously, I think there's a fairness side too, which I'm glad you touched
mm,
on. How nice is that going to be for the consumer, even if they do pump, some tax breaks in there for the people? The one other thing I wanted to ask you about is H-1Bs.
mm,
That's a big thing. How's this going to create high-paying jobs? Because you did mention that there's not going to be that many jobs, at
mm,
least for now, at these data centers when they're getting built for Amazon,
mm,
Google, and Meta, and that the workers I've been reading that are going to be coming in are not going to be your Purdue graduates even. It's
mm.
going to be your H-1Bs that can't speak the language, have never experienced culture before. Where do you see that happening at? Is this going to be a good or a
Mm.
bad thing? Or maybe a positive and a negative to close?
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely beneficial for the families of those workers. There's definitely a lot of considerations to be made. Whenever you have large corporations that are going to be investing a lot somewhere, there's probably going to be less of a reinvestment in the community, which is kind of what you touched on. So that's one thing, and I think we've definitely seen that as a state. A lot of people pushing for, things like the IEDC to invest in local communities and local businesses, and that's kind of why because they end up that money, I mean, no matter how it's spent, it ends up going back to the community, back to Hoosiers that are from the state that have roots here, that have roots in their communities, and that's a really important thing. I think that the family is definitely the fundamental unit of society. So it's something that we do definitely have to consider. And like I said, when you do have large corporations that you're depending on for economic development, I think the strategy is it can be very short-sighted because you kind of lose track of the families that are already here, and recognizing that they are the foremost resource you have. And I think there needs to be more investment in education, more investment in upskilling people right here in the state, so that we have more skilled workers that are able to, you know, fulfill the need for technology workers and other fields like that for sure.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I appreciate you coming on the show today to answer questions. Where can people go to find more of your work at? Obviously, you write more than just AI and data centers, but this has been a big focus over the last little while for you. So, where can people go to see more?
Yeah, you can find me on IndyStar.com. You go into the opinion section, and I have a little tab you can click on, and you can see all my work.
Appreciate it. And one last thing, what is the best thing about living in the Hoosier State? Since obviously we've talked about the good and the bad, a good thing about living in the Hoosier State and the Midwest, in case somebody is hearing this from another country or the coast.
Oh, I would definitely just say affordability. I don't think living anywhere else I could have been able to afford a house at my age. So I've been able to establish roots to start a family, and all while being, pretty, close to the beginning of my life. So very grateful for that. Very grateful to live in Indiana.
And then the biggest, well, you mentioned the biggest pro of the Midwest, it's cheaper than the coast. So I appreciate you sharing that. And be sure to check out his work. You do a really good job. I might not always agree with you, but I appreciate the work that you're doing. So keep it up.
Yeah, thanks.